we should look out for, and today we'll discuss about 10 of those pitfalls.
Yeah. For those interested, the slides can be found on bit.ly, just DDD Drupal Dev Days/SEO. We posted a link at the end as well, so if you want to revisit for the information, you can download it, the slides.
Okay, let's go. So a little bit about us.
Yeah, so I'm brentgees. I'm a Drupal developer and also a Drupal trainer at Dropsolid. I've spoken at a couple of other Drupal camps and also DrupalCon and Dev Days already.
And I'm Wouter. I'm an SEO strategist and evangelist at Dropsolid, and I've also spoken at a couple of Drupal-specific events or a couple of SEO-specific events, so looking forward to this one as well. This is the agenda for today. We're not going to go over this agenda in detail because we'll just dive right in. So these are about 10 subjects about Drupal SEO pitfalls that we will discuss today. Okay. First up, let's discuss public entities. So by default, entities might be publicly available on their own unique URL. So for example, if you have a team member content type, each team member could have their own separate page, the separate publicly available page, while maybe that isn't really necessary. Maybe you don't need your team members to have separate detail pages. Maybe it's enough to have all the team members just on an overview page, and they don't need their separate detail pages. So if you have all those separate detail pages for your team members, and the only thing that's on there is an image and their name, then Google regards this as low value or thin content. So for example, if you have a website of 100 pages and 50 of those pages are just empty team member pages, well then your website is kind of low value. So you don't want those pages to exist, and you don't want them to be indexed by Google either, because they are just a waste of multiple things: resources, bandwidth, crawl budget, and database storage, of course, as well.
Yeah, luckily the solution is pretty simple. For every node or content type or taxonomy term or whatever that you create that don't really need a detail page, it's best to install Rabbit Hole and just make sure that page is not visitable for end clients, so that you don't end up with pages that have no meaning in the site.
Yes, this will make sure in our team member example that we only have the team members on the overview and they don't have their separate detail pages. So they're not accessible, Google can't crawl them, so there's no issue in terms of thin content or low value pages. Something that is sort of related, so all pages on a website should be an entity. And what I mean by that is that sometimes some types of pages on your website are generated based on other content. For example, again, the team overview could be generated based on the team details, but also a homepage could be generated based on other information in the database. And oftentimes these pages are not really editable nodes in the backend. Now, this is an issue for content editors because they need to be able to edit their meta title, their meta description. They need to be able to configure the sitemap XML settings or edit the open graph settings so they can change the image you see when you share the page to Facebook and things like that. But when your page isn't an editable node, when it isn't an editable entity, then there is no easy way for content editors to update that kind of information.
Yeah, I'm sure we all did it in the past, just creating a view page or page manager page. And yes, you can add some SEO to it, but it's not really easy. Luckily, with Drupal core, there's now a layout builder. It's easy to add everything on a basic page. You can add a block on it, you can add a view on it. Everything you want, you can just add on a page, and the end client can just add their SEO. If you don't like layout builder, there's of course also the other option, using paragraphs. The disadvantage of paragraphs is that you can't add blocks automatically, but with a simple module like block field or overview field, you can add the overview, the view page as a block, as a field to a paragraph, and yeah, you can just create a team member page as a page, and a client can edit the content and the SEO tags.
Yep, and same with the homepage and other types of pages that are generated on other types of content. You make it easy for your content editors to edit their meta tag information or open graph information or anything else for that matter.
Yeah. Also, added bonus, if a client wants to add some text above or below a view, they can just add it easily, while in the past it was extra work that was not really fun.
Yes. Next up, we have something about internal search. So internal search, when you have a website that has an internal search functionality, it could be that the internal search result pages are indexable by Google as well. And this also results in low value and thin content on your website, because an internal search, in theory, could be infinite. You could have an infinite amount of internal search result pages. Of course, you do not want them to be indexed by Google either, because that is a very bad user experience, and Google also implicitly mentions it in its quality guidelines that internal search result pages should not be indexed by Google. It's a bad user experience. If you can imagine you're searching for something in Google, you click on the results and then you land on another search result page, but then on another website and not on Google. That is not a good user experience. So Google advises you to de-index or no index your internal search result pages.
Yeah, luckily the solution is, again, very easy. If you followed the hints from the previous problem, all pages should be an entity, then you can just edit the page, and in the metatags, if you install the metatags module, which of course everyone should enable, you can just prevent search engine from indexing this page and prevent search engines from following links on this page. Just checking those two checkboxes and the problem is fixed. If you didn't listen to the previous steps and you still use a view page, meta tag views also exist, and then you can do the same in views, just a little bit more work. Probably requires a config export, and yeah, a little bit more work, but it works as well.
Yes, and this will make sure your search result pages are not indexed by Google, so Google is a happy camper. Next, we have the indexed test environments, which is something we often see occur on live websites as well. So oftentimes we see development and staging environments that are indexable and oftentimes also indexed by search engines. Sometimes this happens because of a configuration issue, sometimes just because of laziness, because somebody didn't care to wall off their development environment or staging environment. And also sometimes temporary content on a live website is indexable and shows up in search results, which we do not want. For a multitude of reasons, I think we can all agree that we don't want our staging environments to show up in Google. You can imagine if you're creating an e-commerce site and you have a staging environment that skips the payment section, for example, you don't want people actually skipping the payment section and ordering your products on a staging environment, which is something that can happen if your testing environment is indexed by Google. These are a couple of screenshots of websites we found. So on the left side, we have a couple of staging sites. On the right side, we have a site from Acquia, from the New York DMV, which is also a development site or staging environment that is just indexed by Google. So I do not know how many people actually visit this site. They could see that in Search Console, but of course, it's something we do not want to happen.
Yeah, well, it's two problems, so two solutions. If you add a test page on a live environment, it's difficult to shield off a live environment because live environment should be available. And if you still use the node, then you can just edit the meta tag and prevent the search engine from indexing this page. That's for live environment. But if you have a test environment like acceptance, development, staging, whatever, it's best to use HTTP password protection. I think the shield module does it, but you can also just set up your own HT access and protect it yourself, whatever you prefer.
Yes, and just to recap, you shouldn't assume that Google will not index your staging environments because you don't have links pointing to it, because a lot of developers think, well, I published it to a publicly available staging environment, but nowhere on the internet there are links to my staging environment, so it won't get indexed, Google won't find it. Google will find it somehow, magically, they will stumble upon your staging environment. So actively try to prevent Google from indexing it by using the techniques described by Brent.
There will always be a client who points a link to the staging environment, so don't trust on that.
Yeah. You can also follow it up. So for example, if you think, well, currently I have a lot of staging environments that aren't walled off, and I want to see how many people are currently at this moment per day visiting the staging environment, then you could install Google Search Console. So I don't know if anybody knows this tool, but it's a free-to-use tool from Google to sort of follow up on your website. And you could just do a domain validation of your staging domain. and then you can see how many people actually visit your staging website per day and which URLs they visit, via which keywords they land on that environment, and so on and so on. So this could be an eye-opener that you can see, oh, a lot of people are visiting my staging environment, I really need to wall it off, or implement redirects that they are redirected to the live environment. Then we have assets that could be blocked by robots.txt. So robots.txt is, of course, a text file on the root of your website, which contains instructions for search engines like Google. And oftentimes, some website assets, like a favicon, or like just images or PDFs or anything for that matter, they could be located inside a folder that is by default walled off or disallowed in the TXT, in the robots.txt. So the directories you see here on this screenshot contain it's a default setup from Drupal, so if you use images in those folders, Google won't be able to crawl those because they are disallowed in the robots.txt. So we want Google to understand and see, in quotes, our entire page as a user views our page. So if a user is able to download all the files and favicons and things like that, there is no reason why Google shouldn't be allowed to view those files either. So we want the Google experience, so to speak, for Googlebot. We want that to be more or less the same as a user that visits the site. So if some assets are blocked using robots.txt, then Google is not allowed to view those files, and then they have a different experience than the regular website visitors. So over here we have a screenshot from the Drupal camp website, and we can see that there is a disallow record in there, which contains the themes/custom wildcard CSS folder. And then we also see, if we look at the HTTP requests, we can see that there is a styles.css file located inside one of those folders. So what this means is that Google will not be able to render the entire page as a regular website visitor would render the page or view the page. So we have a different user experience, or a different experience for the Googlebot and for the user, and you do not want that. You want those to match up as much as possible. Again, if you use Google Search Console, which I explained in the previous section, then you will see a notification of this, something like this. You will see a notification that a page is partially loaded because Google is not allowed to render or download some assets that your website uses. So you do not want this to happen. I suggest you validate all the websites you have in Google Search Console and just look to see if you see any of these notifications. If you do, then the solution will be to modify your robots.txt. So you want to make sure that all your website assets, all the images, all the files you use, style sheets, JavaScript files, you want them to all be located in a publicly available folder that is not blocked by robots.txt. And you could use Google Search Console to keep an eye out for notifications regarding those blocked resources. Now, when would you block URLs from Google? Because robots.txt is something that exists for a reason. Well, say, for example, you have a very big website, and by big website, I mean a website with millions of pages, not hundreds or thousands, but really millions. And a big portion of those pages are, for example, product overviews with facet filtering, for example, an e-commerce store with a dozen or more categories to filter on. Well, then you might want to block Google from crawling all those filtered views because they enlarge your website in such a way that Google is mostly crawling those overviews with filtering parameters instead of the product pages, for example. So that could be a use case to actually disallow something in the robots.txt. But for most websites, for most regular websites, this isn't an issue, and you should just allow everything and allow Google to crawl everything. Next up, we have possible security leaks that could possibly impact your organic visibility in Google or other search engines. For example, if you have public file uploads, let's say you have a website and there are jobs on those pages, and you allow people to add their resume or upload their resume, well, then you should try to make sure that those files do not get indexed by Google. Because if files can be uploaded without any authentication, then hackers or malicious users could also use that to upload torrent files or anything else for that matter. And you don't want those to get indexed by Google, of course. This is a screenshot of a live website where we just searched for a specific site and then added the keyword torrent behind it. And then we can see that this regular website had a lot of torrents indexed by Google, which is not something you want because Google can and will punish you for that. If Google notices that you have a security leak, then they will, or they could give you a manual action. And a manual action is actually a Google employee which spotted that there is something wrong with your website, in this case a security leak, they will flag your website, and that will actively lower your organic visibility in search engines. So you definitely do not want a manual action on your website, and this is one type of manual action that you can get, that is if there is spam detected, which you can see at the bottom right there. User-generated spam is the description here. This is some more information about manual actions. I just talked about this, and there is a solution, of course.
Yeah, there are actually two solutions. The first solution is if you have some form or something to upload on your site, add some spam protection like simple reCAPTCHA, reCAPTCHA, HCAPTCHA. I'm sure there are tons of others, but just add something. It's annoying for the clients, but you can also add invisible, and it will help some spam protection. The second solution is if you have file upload, think, do you really need these files to be publicly available? Most of the times, you can just set it up so that it puts them in the private files, so that only logged in users can see it, or only web admins. So that way you can protect the files from being publicly available by Google. Also, if you, for example, the resume, if I would upload my resume on a site and it's on Google, I would not be happy that my contact info, my address, my phone number is on Google. So think about, should it be public or private, and try to go private as much as possible for uploads.
Yes. Time for a little pop quiz, a short quiz. Let's say we have a customer, and he just recently launched a new website, but he wants to keep his old website, his old URLs. He wants to keep them live on a server just for reference for himself or for his customers, but he doesn't want those to be indexed anymore in Google. So he has old URLs he wants removed out of Google. Now we have three options, and I'm going to just ask you for a show of hands to see who takes which option here, or which road. So option A is you would simply block the pages one by one, or by using a folder structure via the robots.txt, which we saw earlier. For example, by adding just a one-line instruction, disallow the folder old blog with wildcard. Option B is we add a robots meta tag to all the old pages, and we set them to no index. We could also use a header, a robots no index header. That's also an option. Or C, we are playing it safe, and we are blocking using robots.txt, and we are using the robots no index meta tag or header instruction. Those are three options.
So who chooses for A?
Show of hands. Option 1, you will block by using robots.txt.
Nobody?
Nobody. Option B, add a robots meta tag. A couple hands.
3, 5, 6. And C?
And option C, playing it safe, blocking in robots.txt and blocking using a no index.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also 5 or something?
A couple. So options are divided, but nobody chose for A, which is definitely good, but it should have been B. So why this is the case, I will explain in the next section, which is the robots.txt disallow instruction is not the same as a no index instruction using meta tags. So just to recap and put it very simply, a robots.txt instruction, it disallows crawling but not indexing, and a robots no index directive using a meta tag disallows indexing but not crawling. So those are two very specific, very separate things. So it sounds really weird, but if a page is blocked by robots.txt, Google can still index it. If there are other websites pointing towards that page, even though it's disallowed in robots.txt, Google can still index that page. Google won't be able to crawl it, so it won't know the title of that page, it won't know the meta description of that page, won't know the contents of the page, but it will be able to index it. And sometimes that happens as well, because people then often ask me, yes, this is cool that you notice this and all, but does it actually happen in real life that a page that is blocked in robots.txt is indexed by Google? And it does happen. As you can see here, this is the Drupal.org website. And this has been the case for at least 2 or 3 years now. They haven't fixed it yet. So we can see that there is a Drupal.org page indexed, and it says no information is available for this page, and there is no title as well, because Google is not allowed to crawl this page. So if we just dive a little deeper here to see what happened for Drupal.org, we can see that home/home page is indexed by Google. And if we look at the robots.txt file, we can see that there's an instruction here. We notice the comment, Googlebot picked up strange homepage URL somewhere. So Some of the devs did notice, oops, something went wrong here, and they try to fix it by adding a disallow rule in robots.txt. But of course, this had the opposite effect because they disallowed Google from crawling the page, but they didn't disallow it from indexing. So now the page is indexed forever because Google is not able to crawl it and maybe see a no index instruction. So yeah, they really messed up there a little bit. The solution here is to remove the rule from the robots.txt and just set the page to no index with a meta tag. It's as simple as that. But that's the difference between a robots.txt and a no index meta tag. One is for crawling and the other one is for indexing. Next up, let's talk a little bit about Google Analytics. Google Analytics, of course, it's not related to SEO, but it's something that is used to follow up on SEO, to follow up on the organic visibility or the traffic coming in via organic search engines like Google. And something you should always pay close attention to is if you open Google Analytics and you see sudden spikes or sudden drops, because that might often be the case that something went wrong with a dev pushing a new module or with a configuration issue or an update for some module. So something to pay very close attention to. For example, here we have a graph of the page views, and we can see that around the 1st of March, we go to about double the amount of page views, which you can think, yes, we did good, our SEO efforts finally paid off. But actually, if you look a little bit deeper into why the graph looks the way it looks, it was because of a Drupal configuration issue. So things to keep in mind when you push updates of your website, be it an update to a module that's related to Google Analytics, for example, a Google Analytics module or a Google Tag Manager module, always review your data in Google Analytics immediately after pushing, 24 hours after pushing, and 48 hours after pushing the updates, just to make sure that your data is correct. Because data that's in Analytics, let me go back for a little bit, the data that's here, it will stay in there indefinitely. You cannot get that data out and clean it up afterwards. So once it's in there forever. So this really messes with your marketing specialists that really try to interpret your data. So just as a recap, whenever you do a modification to something that could be related to Google Analytics tracking or other forms of tracking, Matoma Analytics, always review your Google Analytics setup and see if everything that's coming in is actually good data. Next up, let's talk a little bit about CLS, cumulative layout shift. So the cumulative layout shift, it measures the visual stability of a page, which is a very important user experience metric for mobile and since recently also for desktop. So this metric is part of a bigger set of user experience metrics called the Core Web Vitals, which are in turn part of the bigger page experience metrics Google introduced. And this is also only something that was introduced in May of 2021. So this is still pretty recent, but this is a metric that measures how visually stable your website is. And there is a short video explaining that, and I hope it will look good on the screen. Yes, it does. So I'll just let it play for a second here. So as you can see here, the user tried to click on the go back button, but when he tried to click, then a section of the page loaded in via Ajax or anything else, and then the button jumped down, and then he accidentally clicked on the submit order button. So this is a worst case scenario, of course, in an e-commerce environment, for example. But this is a CLS issue, and you want to avoid CLS issues wherever you can. Sorry? Yes, definitely. Let's see here. Let's go back. Play. There we go. So you have the place my order button. He wants to click on go back, but then the pro tip at the top pops in, and then he accidentally clicked on the submit order button. So that's the issue. You're welcome. So the top causes of CLS issues are listed here. So hero images, when you have a very heavy hero image on your page and it takes a while for it to load in, then it could push all the content down after half of a second, for example. This is really annoying, and I'm sure everybody will have had this experience already, that you want to click a link, and just as you click it, an image loads in, pushing the link further down. So that's something you want to avoid at all costs. Hero images are a big cause of this. Images in the body content. Sometimes CSS animations could have that issue as well. If you have an ad-heavy website, you have a lot of ads on your website, it could also have CLS issues. And external plugins, like sometimes you have notification bars at the top of the site. The start of Corona 2 years ago, a lot of websites introduced some sort of notifications on their website. and a lot of them use an external plugin, which is a bar at the top of the screen. And whenever that bar pops in, then the entire website pushes down by 50 pixels or something, which introduces a CLS issue on all their pages, which is really bad. There is a solution for it.
Yeah. For the images, when you're just using Blazy or DR image or just the core images, this is not really an issue if you use the most recent version. If you use an older version, it might be an issue, but then you should just update. But when you add some custom coding or something in JavaScript or through Ajax, make sure you test it. And if there's a content jump, make sure there's, preferably in CSS, some place reserved for that new thing, so that if an image loads, that it not jumps, but already keeps the height of the image or for the bar or whatever.
Yes, so in general, to recap, images will be the most frequent issue of, or the most frequent reason of CLS issues. So make sure to reserve space for images. If you have slow connections, that the space is already there. There's just a blank space, and when the image loads in, nothing shifts. It just adds the image to the blank space. And also review all your images or all your pages for visual stability. You could do this manually. You could emulate a slow internet connection, or you can just run a lighthouse audit using your Chrome developer tools, for example. Or you can use dedicated crawling software. There is something called Screaming Frog, which is paid software, but it is free to use if you only have up to 500 resources on your website. So if you have 10 pages or 100 pages or 200 pages even for that matter, you can use Screaming Frog for free. And what that tool does, it's sort of like a Google bot. It crawls your site just like Google would, and you can connect it to, for example, Google Search Console or Google Analytics or other tools, and then you can do a CLS audit automatically. So you can just set up Screaming Frog to crawl your entire website, and it will give you the CLS values for all your pages, so you don't have to review them manually. So that might be the way to go. But if you have a small website, or you just want to spot check some pages or some different types of pages, you can do that manually, of course, as well.
Screaming Frog might also be useful to just check regularly if you have some 404 pages to an external site or something. Can also be found through Screaming Frog.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very useful tool. It's very easy to use. So I advise you, if you have interest in SEO or your customers ask you about SEO and how you can improve the website, really just have a look at Screaming Frog, and it's a very, very useful tool. Then let's talk a bit more about the images. So images can have an impact on your user experience, on your CLS score, but they can also have an impact on your performance of your website. And of course, faster is always better, and that is the case for search engine optimization, but also for user experience. And content editors, they often upload very high quality images, maybe even the original images of 50 megabytes, and they can impact your site performance in a negative way if you don't spend some attention to it.
Yeah, for a solution, you can go pretty far in this. At least, yeah, I would advise you to use the Drupal core image styles. That should already be default, so that you don't load in an image of 10,000 pixels in 5 pixels width. Better is enhancing it with Blazy or DR image to lazy load the images. Even better is conversion to WebP. Just one note, WebP is not supported by Internet Explorer 11, which is not really terrible because people who still use it shouldn't be on the web, but it's still something to keep in mind. And in the future, this will probably be Aviv, but that is also almost never supported, so that's not really that good. And also in Google, you can add some compression by default. That's in Drupal core. By default, it is 75%. Most of the time, it's okay. You can put it higher or lower. And you can also enhance this with image optimize. There are different modules like TinyPNG that will compress an image so that it's smaller automatically.
Yep. So the best solution here as well is to, like the AVIF format is a really, really good image format, but sadly it's not supported by a lot of browsers. But it would be very good if you have it on your website and you use AVIF images and you just fall back to another image format if it's not supported by the browser. That would be an ideal solution. Also, definitely you should educate all your customers and all your content editors, all your people you're using the CMS and uploading images. They should know the basics of what images should they upload on a website, what image compression is, what different image types are, and when to use which types. Because I hear of a lot of customers, they just upload PNGs constantly because they think it's the better image format, but they don't use any transparency on their website, so they don't really need PNGs, and they just upload kilobytes and kilobytes of transparency data that you don't need. So just explain what compression is, explain the image types, and also they could manually compress their images if you don't want to rely on a module to automatically compress to 75%. If they have the time, you could say, well, you can manually compress each and every image by yourself by using a free-to-use tool like Squoosh. I don't know if anybody heard of that yet, but that is a free-to-use tool online. You can just drag and drop an image on that, and then via a slider you can compare the qualities of the image. So you have a quality slider and you see visually instantly what the difference is on your quality of your image. And then you can just download the image and then upload that to your CMS. So that is very useful to use, but it is time intensive because you have to do it manually.
Yeah, also make sure that static images that you add yourself in your theme folder are also compressed. Don't be lazy, just compress them and it will impact SEO quite a bit.
Yes. Now to top it off, we have some sort of rapid fire best practices, some SEO Drupal things that don't really need 5 minutes of speaking time, but just are important nonetheless.
Yeah, the first one, it's always best to aggregate and minify your CSS and JS files. The less HTTP requests you have, the better. You can use Advag for it by default in Drupal. You can also use your own theme that in Gulp will minify and compress this, but Advag works as well.
Yeah, and it's definitely a best practice to try the aggregation first, and then if there are issues that cannot be fixed, then you can disable it. Because we have developers as well that say, let's always disable aggregation because it always gives us issues. Well, it might sometimes give issues, but try it nonetheless, because it is better to aggregate all the separate small JavaScript files in one bigger or two bigger JavaScript files. You can also use the path auto module to generate clean looking URLs. You don't want /node/12345 in your URL. You want clean readable URLs, and you want them to be translated as well if you have a multilingual website. For example, here is a screenshot of Drupal camp, and then we can see that there are a lot of URLs indexed that still contain the word node in the path, which is something we do not want, just for readability and for SEO. And this is another website of bpost, which shows you Dutch pages, but they contain the name products and products overview in their path. So their fixed names aren't translated.
Yeah, always make sure your page is as fast as possible. That should be, yeah, common sense. But the Drupal default caching is already very good, but you could go more in depth with it. Varnish, Memcache, Redis, depending on your solution that you're developing, one of these might even enhance the performance even more.
Also, the canonical tag is a very important part in terms of SEO. Now, depending on the complexity of your website, you might want to have a separate SEO specialist to have a deeper look into the canonical tag. If you have a rather simple website that doesn't have facet filtering, that doesn't have a lot of special modules, an easy website, then you can just always use your absolute path as the canonical tag. But for complex websites, you might want to consult an SEO specialist because sometimes some different setup has to be done for specific types of pages. Some best practices for the canonical tag: always use absolute URLs, no relative paths, just always the full absolute URL. Make sure all canonical tags return a status code 200. So for example, what we often see is that the canonical tag contains the www version of a URL, and if you actually go to that URL, you get 301 redirected to the non-W version. So you don't want that. You want all your canonical tags to return a 200 status code. And you also, in most cases, want to omit any URL parameters. So if you have filtering parameters from your web shop, for example, that are added to the URL, you want to omit those from the canonical tag so that your canonical tag is just clean looking. One parameter that you should add to your canonical tag is the paging parameter. That should be available in your canonical tag, unless you have a view all page. So as you can see, there are some exceptions in some cases, which is why it's always a good idea to consult somebody with SEO knowledge regarding your canonical setup. Also, your canonical tags, of course, should not point to node URLs, which we saw earlier. You should just have clean URLs, and node URLs shouldn't exist on your website. They shouldn't be indexable. So if you follow the previous steps, you won't have this issue of node URLs as your canonical URL.
Yeah, also, if you have a site in multiple languages, try to translate it as much as possible. The best solution, of course, is just to translate everything. But if your client is very lazy, you can also solve this by denying access to untranslated pages by using a module like content language access. This is most of the time best, just because, otherwise Google might become confused. It loads an English page and sees some Dutch text or some French text, and it doesn't really know what to do. So try to translate everything as much as possible, or hide the pages, if that's okay for the client, of course.
Yes. Also, best practice is to follow up on the amount of pages on your website or on your domain that are indexed by Google. Again, using a tool like Google Search Console, you can just easily follow up on how many pages are actually indexed by Google. And the reason why you should do this is that you can sort of have a feeling, are the amount of pages, is it too high? Then maybe something is wrong with your rabbit hole setup. Maybe you have the issue that we discussed earlier, that all your team member pages all have separate detail pages and they all get indexed. Well, that shouldn't be the case. Maybe you can spot that here if you see, oh, there are way too much pages indexed. Or it could be too low, and then maybe you index some pages that shouldn't be indexed. Something we saw with audits we've done is when a new website is launched, the staging environment gets pushed to the live environment, but they forgot to remove all the no-index tags. And then after 1 month, the client comes back and says, well, our new site isn't receiving any traffic. How come? And then we can see that the website has been live for 1 month and all the pages are no-indexed. So, of course, that's not something you want to happen, but you can follow this up quickly in Google Search Console by just looking at the page count that is indexed and comparing it to the amount of pages you think are on your website, or the amount of pages a tool like Screaming Frog shows you are on your website.
Also make sure your base URL is not HTTP default in your sitemap XML. So just have a look at your sitemap. Is it the correct sitemap? Normally, this should be correct with the latest sitemap modules. You can also see this in Google Search Console. But if it's not correct, then you can set the default base URL in the sitemap module, or also pass the URL with Drush. I don't know if it's possible with the latest Drush version, but the best solution is the top one. But if you're still using an older Drush and Drupal version, the bottom one might be the solution for you.
Yeah, because this is an issue that we've seen a lot in the past, that the sitemap XML, instead of the actual domain name, just contained the default instead of the domain name. And then in Google Search Console, if you use that tool, then you will see an error like this. You will see in this case 100 URLs were submitted and they all return a 404 because, of course, the default doesn't exist. Also, something very simple, use the Google Analytics module. If you use Google Analytics, use the Google Analytics module or the Google Tag Manager module, not both. You could set it up that you use Google Tag Manager for, I don't know, hotjar tracking or other tools that or Facebook pixels that you add, and you say, well, I will keep Google Analytics in my Google Analytics module and just use both. But we've seen in the past that this often leads to issues that, whoops, somebody also integrated Google Analytics in Google Tag Manager, and suddenly you have two tools tracking Google Analytics, and you have double the amount of page views, and then you come back to the graph I showed earlier of the amount of page views suddenly doubling just because of a configuration issue. So as a best practice, use GTM or use the Google Analytics module, but not both at the same time. So this is also an example of something that went wrong. This is actually the issue I just discussed. So the amount of page views doubled and the bounce rate dropped because every page view sent 2 page views to Google Analytics, once using the Google Analytics module and once using the Google Tag Manager setup. So a configuration issue that led to big data issues in their Google Analytics.
And also can't be fixed anymore.
Yes. So that's it. Those are some Drupal SEO pitfalls. Are there any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. I had a question about the quiz question you were asking. I mean, obviously obviously I get the point you're trying to make there, but if you're truly looking at SEO, shouldn't it be a better advice to this client to keep those pages just online and indexable? I mean, when content goes away, it can like really affect your search ranking, right?
You're talking about the case where a new website goes live, probably.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And where like old content,
Yeah.
they think, okay,
Yeah.
well, it's not really relevant anymore.
Yeah, I understand your question. It's a good question because yeah, it was relevant for the case. But if you have a real life website and you have a new version of a website, you should always and really always perform a URL migration. So you should always have a list of all your old URLs and add 301 redirects to your new URL if they changed domains or paths, anything for that matter, so that all old pages, they redirect to the new version of that page. And if, for example, let's say you have a web shop, you renew your web shop, and there is some category of items you no longer sell, then it's okay to just 404 those pages. Don't all redirect them to the home page because you think it's better for Google that you don't land on a 404. No, if a category ceases to exist, you can just 404 them. And that's actually something Google tells in their guidelines as well. If you set up a migration for your new website, always point them to the new page and not all to the home page. Yeah. So yeah, good question. Always perform a URL migration. Always, before releasing a new site, crawl the old site using, for example, Screaming Frog, so you have the list of URLs, and make sure all those old URLs, when a new website is live, they still work and they redirect to a page that gives 200 in the end and shows the correct content.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you. Any more?
Yep, thanks. So about the CLS problem that
Yes.
you said before, okay? So you said us that for images you can use Blazy or DR image and so on. But you also said something about CSS animation.
Yes.
What you can do to fix this problem with CSS animation? Because now website have a lot of animation, have a lot of movement and so on. So it's quite common that the page is building while you're scrolling. So how do you manage this problem with this feature?
Yeah, it's just something you should be aware of, that CSS animations could result in CLS issues. So it's not a fact that all animations automatically have CLS issues. You can have an animation of a button if you hover it, for example. It will not present, most of the time, it will not result in CLS issues. It's only an issue if you animate something and the animation has an effect on all the content that is below that element on the page. Then you can have a CLS problem.
So it's better to hide the element, for example, for an animation like this, it's better to hide the element but keep the same space.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Or even try to avoid some of the CSS animations if it's really annoying. They should help with something. They should not just be funny always.
Yeah, try to explain sometimes.
I know. But it's definitely just something to be aware of, that they could impact your CLS, but it's not that they will always impact your CLS. Just be aware that it exists and that you should review your site if it has a CLS issue because of those animations.
Yeah. Someone else has questions?
Nobody?
No.
Okay, well then thank you for your attention. I hope
Yeah.
it was interesting. If you have any more questions about SEO, you can find us at the Drop Solid booth in the entrance, and we'll be glad to answer them.
Yeah, also feel free to come over, throw some darts, you can win some beer. So, and it's beer brewed by him.
Yes.
So yeah, and also some shameless plug. I created recently a PHP Storm live template, and I posted on GitLab. So if you want, if you're coding and you're lazy, then you can use some snippets in PHP Storm, and also a link to the session again.
Thank you.